Welcome to Cultural Luminaries, where we explore the bold ideas, creative leadership, and systems shifts shaping the future of work and society. I'm your host, Jyoti Jani, author, strategist, and experienced designer. And this series is all about spotlighting the changemakers who are reimagining culture from the inside out. In every episode, we dive into the power of creativity, play, and emotional intelligence in leadership because thriving systems aren't just about strategy, they're about how we design for human connection, trust, and innovation. Whether you're leading a team, building a movement, or just looking to challenge the status quo, you're in the right place. Welcome and thank you so much for being here. I'm delighted to have you join me today. Today, I'm excited to welcome a very special guest to the show. Sheryl Cababa is the author of Closing the Loop Systems Thinking for Designers. She drives a human centered design practice that is focused on systems thinking and evidence based design. She is the Chief Strategy Officer for Optimistic Design, a design insights and development studio based here in Seattle, and leads an equity-centered design practice focused on using design to help clients reimagine education, working on education investment strategy with partners like the Gates Foundation, and capacity building with product teams to incorporate equity-centered practices in their design and development processes. She is also an international speaker and workshop facilitator, as well as an instructor with the University of Washington's Human Centered Design and Engineering program. An all around incredible human. Welcome to the show, Sheryl. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jyoti. I appreciate you and I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. You have inspired me since 2018. And, in 2018, I heard you speak on stage at the Seattle Interactive Conference. And I remember that talk forever changed me because I had never seen someone on a public stage so clearly and courageously kind of speak to the news and some of the disturbing things that we were seeing on the news at that time and how they were related to what was happening inside of our workplaces. And you shared at that time some of what Facebook was doing in Myanmar with inciting a genocide, and how we as designers, as technologists, have a responsibility to really think more broadly about our impact in the world. And that really touched me. It completely like rocked my world. And today, as we're setting the stage for our conversation, I do want to talk a little bit about the current news cycle because I know that myself and a lot of our audience might be again kind of concerned and disturbed about what we're seeing play out. And as systems thinkers, I think it's really important for us to connect those dots for people. But before we get into that question, I ask a question of all my guests, something a little lighter. What is lighting you up these days? I know you're a creative, and I'd love to know how you are nourishing your creative spirit through these times.
Yeah, I think I don't know, it's really I think we're in this moment. I do feel like we're in some dark times. It's funny hearing you talk about my talk in 2018 and how, I was kind of talking about the alarming sort of a state of the world at that time and the state of tech. And I'm like, right now, 2025, I'm like, buckle up, kids. Like we are in a wilder cycle than that ever was in 2018. But I think I don't know. I think like it seems very trite to say. I think we all need to all of us who are kind of opposed to this administration and what it's doing and its sort of philosophy about things need to engage in like a certain level of like self-care and make sure like we're taking care of ourselves. Like I think one of the things there's just like a couple of like personal things I've been really enjoying is like feel really lucky to live in the Pacific Northwest where we have like really incredible access to nature. And so trying to get outside and like go camping and stuff like that, like even in the winter, I think is really nice. And I just think it's important to like ground yourself in that sort of thing so that we have the energy to basically kind of like work towards what we want to see happen in the world. So it's things like that. I'm also doing like things like clothing repair instead of buying new things, just like the little things you can do in your own life that just sort of give you like that energize you to kind of do the bigger work as well.
Mm. No, I love that. And working with your hands, getting out in nature,
Hmm.
those are things that are close to my heart. We're blessed to have access to green space here. Um, so yeah, like as a systems thinker, I'm really curious to kind of understand and hear your perspective on what signals you are paying attention to that you think are important for us to pay attention to as leaders, as designers. You know, before we hit stream today, we were talking a little bit about the level of manufactured outrage that is being thrown at us, and how on the one hand, we want to be aware, we want to be informed, but on the other hand, we know that there's a level of intentionality that's going into manufacturing fear and kind of scarcity. And so, tell me, like, as a systems thinker who I admire and respect, what signals do you think we as leaders should be paying attention to within our broader ecosystem right now, and that are most relevant to the work that we're doing when we show up every day and bite the good bite?
Yeah. One thing that I've been trying to emphasize in my practices, especially when I teach systems thinking, and I think this has to do with like the kinds of things I've done systems analysis for, is like we really should always be paying attention to the economy of attention. So just kind of thinking about like where we're putting our attention, where people are manipulating our attention, and like think about like what's happening in the news. I mean, we're going through a lot right now. And if anyone watches this like much later on, this is February 2025. So we're just like starting out with a new administration that's trying to do a lot of damage. And I think it's not just like the immediacy of what's happening. It's like we also have to think at that meta level. And I'm not talking about Meta, the company, I'm talking about like the concept at the meta level of considering like where are we being manipulated, or where are we being called upon to like draw our attention, and how do they try to control and manufacture our attention and outrage, and then kind of like move on to the next thing. It's almost like a bombardment, and be really strategic about what we need to pay attention to and what needs to create change. Because if we spend time and energy reacting to everything and being outraged by everything, we will experience outrage fatigue. There's a really nice article in Scientific American talking about outrage fatigue and how it's a real thing. And we have to be really careful about how we respond to things, and then try to consider like what are the things that I need to pay attention to that I can um, take action towards, even if it's kind of like in small ways. And I think that helps us kind of like keep things in perspective a little bit. There's a lot of things right now that are happening, that the current executive administration is doing that are like wildly illegal, and it's just kind of like they honestly like cannot do that. And I think we just need to really like kind of put those things in perspective about like what machinery is in place to kind of prevent things from happening already, and where is our attention actually useful and needed. So I think that's something for all of us to analyze and decide where the right place is for that, but to just kind of keep that awareness level of like what are people trying to like steal my attention towards, and like is it worth paying attention to.
Yeah, no, that's very sage advice. And attention is basically most valuable currency, right? So,
Right.
excuse me. So, recently you switched from your employer being substantial to now being optimistic design. I'd love for you to share a little bit about the work that you've been doing at optimistic design and the story about why was this design studio stood up and what kinds of things are you getting to work on through this practice.
Yeah, so I can kind of explain the relationship a little bit. Like Substantial is still our sister organization and our parent company, and Optimistic Design is a subsidiary of Substantial. And essentially, what we wanted to do is create a really targeted practice around, yeah, equity centered design and mostly centered in education. Like that's where a lot of our work lies and how we can kind of make systemic change in education, especially to serve those who have been historically excluded and use design as a tool for such. Yeah, Substantial still does amazing work in product design and development. We're just a little bit more narrowly focused on our, the domain in which we work, as well as the methods we use, which are basically design, research, and strategy. Um, and so what that means is that we work with a lot of our clients around helping them learn and understand what it means to design for those and design with those who are historically excluded, how to engage in co-design and participatory design, and how to always keep a systems lens on their decision making and their and to be really intentional about the impact that they're trying to have. So we oftentimes engage particularly end users and end beneficiaries within the education space who haven't always been part of the processes of design and development. And that includes like students and teachers from marginalized communities. That includes really incredible researchers who are systems experts at the intersection of equity and education. And it means working really closely with our clients who are oftentimes philanthropic funders and ed tech companies who are kind of investing in and designing solutions. So it is really taking that sort of systems lens of having um, multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary system stakeholders involved in the process and the processes of designing and kind of creating preferable futures in education. These are long-term projects too. As my friend and colleague SL Rao, we work really closely together, said this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we can kind of think about like the current um, just sort of like news environment and what have you in the same way too. It's like, how do we kind of like manage our energies to ensure that preferable outcomes happen and that we think about it from a long term lens instead of like a completely reactionary lens? If we're just like totally just like reacting to things, I don't like to put it this way, but it's like they win, right? If you're just like, constantly like reacting to the kind of like hate and bigotry that drive like a lot of like the decision making that's happening now. So we have to kind of like keep reminding ourselves this is a marathon, not a sprint. Systems thinking and systems change it's incremental. It can be slow moving, but it can also create like incredible holistic change. So that's a little bit about optimistic design, what we're
Mm-hmm.
focused on, and kind of like the space in which we love working, which is education. We're also doing work in global health as well. So these spaces that where it really is like helping to create greater equity.
Mm. I love that you've been able to kind of focus in on some really impactful um, areas within the education sector and social sector that really make a difference. And as a mum, I know how important making real change in the education sector, how important it is for our kids and our futures, especially when it comes to technology and the rapid changes that we see happening with just the entire education sector is changing so quickly right now, and the needs of children are changing so quickly as well in terms of how do we really set the next generation up with the skills that they need to succeed in the world that is being birthed as we speak. You know, like there's just so much changing. And can you give an example of a product or a service that you've been working on or a project, and talk a little bit about some of the systems levers, the systems dynamics that you're really examining in this space?
Yeah, we recently worked on a project with the Gates Foundation called Modernizing Math, and you can actually see the work. We created a report in the toolkit at modernizingmath.com, and this was really oriented around thinking about what math education might look like in like 15 to 20 years, and what does it look like for students, as I mentioned before, who have been historically excluded and who tend to be those who, for various systemic barriers, cannot succeed in today's system, or like it's harder for them to succeed in today's system. And, we're talking about students experiencing poverty, Black and Latinx students, and multilingual learners, for example, in the US education system. And what was really cool about this project is that we didn't just go off and do a bunch of research and then say, oh, these are like what we think needs to happen, or these are like the recommended changes. We actually worked with students doing co-design and participatory design. We also worked with parents and teachers for them to kind of I guess, articulate their visions of how they think math education could change in the future. And we kind of brought to the table concepts like generative AI. Like, what do you think about like generative AI and the landscape that it's in currently? Um, how do you think that could manifest differently in the future? And so much of what came up, first of all, like students are really super creative thinkers, and that work is really fun and joyful because, like, oftentimes these folks are not involved in thinking long term about educational experiences. Like, we're like, oh, yeah, you're thinking 15 years in the future, can like think about all the different types of technology that can be used and like the different kinds of environments or the different dynamics, or maybe there aren't exams. Okay, that came up a lot. Was like there aren't tests and exams. Like, um, how, and we know that these are kind of areas that are problematic for a lot of students, right? And just giving them that space to kind of like dream about the future was really, it wasn't only fun, it was also interesting and really fruitful in terms
Mm.
of just like truly involving those who are most affected in the system helps you come up with like really interesting ways of looking at the problem space as well as looking at potential areas of solution. So when students and teachers, for example, are thinking about AI, oftentimes there's like a fear there because, and you start understanding where that fear comes from. It comes from the fact that they're currently excluded in the design of these technology systems. So they're like, this actually would be like fun and useful. And I would love it if people who are kind of like me were involved in making it. There's like such a clear understanding that who is controlling, um, the creation of these types of powerful technologies is not reflective of who the folks we were working with, and that they know that it makes a difference. I think this is why it's such a bummer. Like all of this, like talk about eliminating like DEI is just like such a distraction about like who do we give opportunity to succeed, for example, in the technology sector, and how could they actually make things not just more inclusive but more innovative by being involved. Um, and so students were kind of like bringing up things like that. Like, I want to be able to be part of the design of those systems. So even though we are bringing them into the space to kind of talk about what math experiences might be like, they would take it up a couple of levels and say, I want to actually design the AI that we use in our classrooms. Like, how would we as students get to do that? And these were just kind of like some of the ways that they were thinking about how math education would change. So one thing we did from a systems thinking level is to kind of take a lot of the things that we were hearing and then think about, well, what are the emerging technology principles we should be thinking about as we think about the future of math and STEM education? And then also, what are the potential levers? Like, how do you, if someone were to invest in different areas of this, for example, changing how assessments happen in math, what are the levers that they could engage in to make that happen over the next couple of decades? So I think that kind of work is really interesting because I think oftentimes, especially those of us who work in the technology sector, think about things really short term. We think in terms of like, what's a product now that can kind of make change? And I think we need to be having these more like long term visions that allow us to kind of dream about the future and kind of work backwards from that. And that's like one of the powerful aspects of systems thinking, and also, you know, using design as a speculative kind of practice to allow you to kind of think about what those futures might look like.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's so powerful in understanding not just how bringing the actual people who are most impacted by a design into that creative process, but also thinking just longer term in terms of our timelines and understanding the ripple effects and the impacts of how what we're creating really do stretch out into the future. Um, I, as you're talking, I'm just thinking about the many people who might be listening in on this conversation and who might not work in the design space. They might work in a different industry or a different context. And one of the things I want to ask you about is, how do those who are struggling with the kind of short term closed door aspects of perhaps strategy development, so much strategy development happens with a small group of high power individuals, and really just focusing on kind of maybe shorter timelines, and coming from an environment that was kind of very much entrenched in kind of short-term reactionary thinking. The objections always come up in terms of opening up like a strategic process in terms of costs. Like we can't afford to bring these people into the conversation. We have these kind of burning issues, and this is what we want to develop a strategy in response to. um, I know that there's a huge opportunity that's lost when we are thinking about not opening up a strategic or creative process to the right people and over longer timelines. What advice would you have for people and leaders who are struggling with kind of communicating to others the value of this work of bringing in and opening up a process both with the right people as well as the right timelines? How do you think about that value, and what advice might you give to others in terms of helping others understand the value of that work?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are kind of in situations within their organizations where they're kind of like, oh, all we're doing is just putting out fires all the time, or like we're only just like reacting to quarterly earning statements,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that's what we're tasked with solving for. I think most organizations, I might be wrong about this in terms of like who is actually involved, but like as you mentioned, there are strategic planning like activities that happen within organizations because like this is how they make investments in things that they do want to think about long term. And so one, I think if there are people who are like somewhat mid-level or higher leaders within their organization, is kind of like think about how you could make this more inclusive of like other employees that are within your organization, because I think you miss out on a lot of potential ideation, potential innovation by keeping it close to existing leadership that kind of thinks in very similar ways to each other. I also think if you are somebody who's not in a position to be in those spaces or to have influence in those spaces, um, you can start using the kinds of systems tools that help you connect longer term strategy with the shorter term things that you're doing. So, some of the things that I use with teams in my book are things like, create a theory of change, like map your activities to outcomes and long term outcomes that you want to see. Um, do exercises that are oriented around thinking about not just first degree effects, but also second degree and third degree effects. There's a framework called the futures wheel that I use a lot with organizations. You can basically do that in a 1 hour just like working session with a team or like with a leadership team or what have you, and it surfaces a lot of interesting things. First of all, it surfaces everybody's assumptions about stuff, which is like something we don't do often enough in organizations. But there are these very kind of small ways that you can integrate more longer term kind of like outcomes focused thinking within your existing activities that at least helps you articulate, like at least helps you make explicit when things that you're working on are not aligned with the preferable futures like
Mm-hmm.
you and maybe others in the organization want to see. So if you're talking about like you're designing features that are oriented around engagement. I don't know. I'm still always like thinking about engagement with like technology platforms. Um, but if you're designing like a feature that encourages more engagement for kids or something like that, um, I think it's worthwhile to kind of do some outcomes mapping on that to kind of see like what are the potential like unintended consequences of this? What are the outcomes we're actually seeking, not just short term, but also long term. So short term might be like more eyeballs for longer periods of time, but like what does it mean long term for our users, as well as like, what are kind of like the potential harms that might come of that. And it might not feel like you can do anything about that right now, but just making it explicit, documenting and making it explicit starts like stepping towards at least understanding where you might not be aligned with your organization and whether they're an organization that's willing to change or not. And that tells you a story of like if that's a place you want to keep working.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I work a lot with students and like young designers, and I get a lot of questions about like, well, what if I'm working for some company? What if I'm working for like a big technology company? I don't agree with what they're doing. And I'm like, well, everybody has their own limit, right? And you have a choice to make then. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like not up to me to say like, yes, you should keep working inside of that organization trying to create change if you think change can't be um, positive change can't happen. But if you do think positive change can happen, then maybe you should keep working there. And if it's not a source of frustration for you, I think the question they're really asking me is, can I keep working for an organization that's not values aligned with what I want to see in the world? And the only answer I can give people is like, that's up to you. It might not, and I think there's oftentimes this sort of like sometimes people are like it's easy for you because you are doing work that is like values aligned with what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm kind of like this did not happen accidentally. This happened with a lot of like career choices that brought me to where I am today. Trust me, I worked at like technology companies where I didn't always agree with what I was doing with them for the first half of my career, but I wanted to intentionally get away from that. And that's like where I started shaping long term like my own career so that I would end up in a place where I
Mm-hmm.
could sleep at night with like the work that I'm doing. And I think it's like, yeah, that's not a trivial thing, I think. And really, it's a very like personal decision and personal like career strategy if
Mm-hmm.
you want to make sure you're doing value aligned work.
Yeah. Oh, I love that perspective. And as an individual that's also kind of left toxic relationships with organizations before, I know that there's a lot of power and agency that comes from saying no to something that you don't want so that you can say yes to something that you do want. um, but even in the case that somebody doesn't leave an organization, and I'm thinking about, while I have worked for organizations that have had their own set of challenges, for me, even just the process of being able to surface what some of these consequences, struggles, challenges are, helps you find your people within that organization.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the most values aligned work I've been able to do, even in a less than perfect situation, has come from acknowledging what a problem is, finding people that also care about that, and then working towards it. And I think, from an organizational standpoint, an organization really benefits when people care enough to organize and start changing some kind of cultural element, or at least attempting to, um, so that that problem doesn't just persist at the same magnitude
Yeah.
that it has been. Because any work that you can do to invest in and direct your energy towards addressing some of these like deep rooted issues, like in my situation, it was working on employee learning and development programming, and really investing in people's learning and growth is something that is fulfilling. Like, no matter where you work and no matter what your organization is doing, like for me, it's always worthwhile to invest in people and helping them to be healthy and successful. So yeah, and it just keeps that relationship more reciprocal, so that
Yeah.
both parties are benefiting. And I think, broadly, and as a systems change practitioner, as a cultural change practitioner, I know that when we're not kind of just accepting harmful behaviors, we are not like embodying and storing that repressed energy into our nervous systems, right? Which is where it can do a lot of damage, and where we see now a lot of data and research showing that the cost of staying silent about things that matter, there actually is a physiological health, adverse health outcomes that come from that. So it's good for all of us to acknowledge the stuff that might be painful to admit, because we can do something about it, and it's good for our health and well-being. Good.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And I just think like you have more personal power than you think. And I remember at one point a few years ago, I was doing a project with Facebook, and a lot of my colleagues were like, "Why are you doing this project with Facebook? Like, it's just like after like all of the things that you do and say, like from a systems thinking perspective about them, like, why are you going to be doing a project like this?" And I was like, "Well, I really believe in the team of people that I was working with to mitigate some of the harm that I think oftentimes that company causes, right?" And because they were kind of doing this work that was explicitly about mitigating harm, I was like, yeah, I want to see people like that in the inside, because honestly, like they're going to continue to exist and they could have like the worst monsters working for them and, continue to do ridiculous amounts of harm. But then if they have like at least like some people in there who are like, I'm not okay with this and I want to like change it, then I want to be able to support that, because I think there are limits to what we can there are limits to what we can do on the inside, but I'm happy that those people are there. I think at the end of the day I'm like ultimately kind of like a realist. Like I am an optimistic realist.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of thinking about like where you can make change. Incremental change is like super, super unsexy to a lot of people. Like they want like a TED talk of major change, right? And
Yeah.
I'm just like, no, like the work happens in like really small ways, and it's like the chipping away
Mm-hmm.
to kind of do the good work is can make a huge difference.
Oh, no, it's a really, I think, a healthy and important reminder through these times, because even for me, like, I find myself being quite judgmental, um, of people that work within, companies that are the most harmful. And it's one of the things I've had to remind myself is like, actually, there's a lot of really great, amazing people inside of these organizations trying to make a living. And I think that it can be quite harmful to our social movements when we judge each other for the decisions that we're making in order to survive. And that there's a lot more power in understanding that we all have a role to play and that there are all things that we can be doing. Um, because, yeah, like social change is not going to only happen from outside of institutions, it happens everywhere. And the more that we kind of understand and engage people as potential allies, collaborators, co conspirators, the more that our movement gains power. Because I always like to say, like, it's not us versus them. The us versus them mentality, this mentality of seeing other humans as enemies, I think is really harmful and distracting. Like, I like to say that it's actually all of us against abuse of power or systems that cause harm. And when we recognize that those systems exist, um, inside of us, like, because we're all kind of contributing to and upholding these systems in some ways, um, then we get less judgmental about it, and actually we can just roll up our sleeves and get to work and do what we need to do, to actually make the changes that need to happen.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like even if like I although like at the same time, if you have problems with like what your organization is doing and you aren't like you feel uncomfortable and bad about it but you aren't doing anything on the inside to create change, you
Hmm.
probably have a choice to make.
Yeah.
And you probably like should not be working within that organization. And it's just like, but I do think like a good example right now is like all of these like federal employees who have like chaos happening around them, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I hope you all stay steady and
Yeah.
just like stay within that organization, even though like you don't like what's happening, you don't like what's happening in this administration. It's like, but you like we like the rest of society needs you there. You know what I mean? And like I think it's kind of like thinking about
Mm.
things in that way, especially for those who are in organizations where it's like, oh, is this organization creating harm? Can I stop things or can I not? And really, it's a very like personal decision to make for a lot of people. I know where I have like pretty good self awareness of where my limits are, and I just like encourage others to like think about like what are your limits and like where do you think you like what do you have both like the courage and the energy to do?
Totally. Yeah, it's boundaries. It's healthy boundary setting. And I work with clients on this too, which is, you don't have to say it out loud, but if your needs or requests or demands are not met as you push for change, then what will you do? Knowing what you will do, what you're willing to do if your needs and your desires are not met, is a really important, like, mental practice. Because otherwise otherwise we just tolerate so much, and that becomes a slippery slope of what we are capable of doing and contributing to. So be boundaried and
Yeah.
don't and stick to them. um oh, so what a great conversation this has been. So, systems thinking is just such a powerful tool, especially through these times that we're living in, because our systems are increasingly more complex, they're increasingly interconnected, and they're also changing at a more rapid pace than they ever have, I think, in history. Especially right now, where we see, where we're kind of just at the upswell of this rise of generative AI, completely changing the nature of how we're working and communicating right now. And so I know that the imperative for systems thinking, not just for designers and technologists, but for everybody, is so important through these times. And so I want to ask you, as we're wrapping up our conversation, what's one change that you hope leaders will see, or what's one shift you hope in how leaders approach it using systems thinking in the coming years? Like, how do you think that we should redefine our relationship to this capacity, this skill of systems thinking?
Yeah, I think one thing that comes up for us a lot is like, especially when we're doing like futures thinking project work. I think it's like keeping in perspective just what's happened before, like keeping historical context in terms of like whatever it is that we're doing and working on. So for example, with the modernizing math project that we worked on, we talked about, like in our report, we talked about the historical context of exclusion for many students, like throughout, U.S. history, and that sets the stage for basically the things that you see today and the decisions we continue to make. I think it's really important with generative AI too, is like think about the historical context of like the inputs of what trains generative AI, as well as like the kind of data that it's ingesting, and whether that's going to reinforce things that we don't necessarily want reinforced, that have been, part of our history as a society. And how do we kind of like make decisions about that? And so I think there's a lot to be learned from like what has happened before, especially when we're designing for technology. I think, we forget what it was like. I remember I heard an interview with somebody who has been like a paralegal for the last like 50 years. And she was like, they were asking her about generative AI and how it was around the time when that one lawyer was caught like uh, using citation from ChatGPT or something, and it turned out to be hallucinated. And they were interviewing this paralegal, and she was like, oh my gosh, I've been in this business for a long time. When computers first came out, people were like, that's the end of our jobs. Like, that's the end of our jobs. And she's like, no, what ends up happening is they just like give us like some other adjacent job, or just like they give us more work, even though this computer can do all of this stuff. So she's like, I'm not worried about my job going away, because like I've seen like too many cycles of this. And I think we just sometimes get into this hysteria, like kind of a little bit of like a moral panic around new technologies that isn't helpful. So we have to make sure we have like a grounded and rational lens towards like what are the real harms that could happen from this, and what are like the things that just might be moral panic around like something new and new technology. The technologist Genevieve Bell has done a lot of work in that space, a lot of thinking around that space of like moral panic around technology, and has some really good prompts for like organizations to use around like what is truly moral panic around emerging technology. So kind of like keeping those kinds of historical context in mind is something that I hope leaders will do. I mean, a lot of the things we're seeing right now with this new administration is like the result of 40 years of strategy, from right wing parties. And I think it's like really oriented around, that saying that's like, when you've experienced privilege, equality looks like oppression. I think that's kind of like what's happening right now, which is where we're getting like this blowback moment in time. And it's really up to us, like who are opposed to that, to kind of stay steady and encourage like the further change that we want to see, and also kind of understand what we don't want reinforced from history. And so, I think that's something that I would love everyone to kind of keep a lens on, is like what has happened before and how can it have an impact on what's happening right now, and what kinds of decisions we're about to make. And I think it's just like a really helpful lens to always kind of keep in mind is that sort of context. I mean, it is a systemic context. It's like kind of thinking about um like history and the intersection of like systems, I think is like a really good lens to keep in mind.
I love it. I love it because systems essentially are the behavior over time, right? Like, so systems
Right.
exist because we're looking at patterns over time. And I love that because we got here today by the past and we're going to get to the future by what we're doing now will one day be the past as well. So it's all just about this, like, this timeline and what we can do to intervene and shift some of these long-standing patterns, because history certainly does seem to repeat itself in the cyclical nature of dynamics and change. So um, it's a really good reminder to stay rooted, um, because those dynamics that have existed, for a long time could exist for a long time unless we interrupt them. And so it's one of the reasons I'm so grateful and inspired by you and your work, Sheryl. So thank you for being a beacon of inspiration, because I know it makes a difference to a lot of people, including myself. So appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you too, Trophy. And yeah, I think it's like connecting just sort of like a systemic lens to the personal and to kind of like interpersonal and just like staying grounded in like your communities and communities you care about is just like so important. And yeah, I really appreciate kind of like the lens you bring to the table as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I know what my North Star is, and that's creating safety. Like, when I think about what I felt like when I haven't had an embodied sense of safety and why, I know that that's it's a really big deal. Now, there's a lot of people that experience a lack of safety, and from a neuroscience standpoint, we can't access the creative thinking, the strategic thinking we really need to show up and be the best problem solvers and designers we can be. So for me, I'm like, safety first, always. Emotional safety, psychological safety, physical safety. That's my North Star, and it helps me sleep at night, and it helps me know
Hmm.
what I need to do when I wake up in the morning. So um, I'm grateful for that, for sure.
Yeah, I
Uh,
love that.
so for those in our audience who might want to continue to follow your work and stay tuned to what you got cooking, um, please let us know, like, the best way to do that. Your book, Closing the Loop, is such an incredible resource, not just for designers, but I think for anybody who wants to kind of introduce practical systems thinking tools into their toolkit. It's been so great to see this book out in the wild, and to see you um, doing a lot of talks and traveling and sharing the wisdom of your framework and your approaches with the world. So how can people go buy your book? How can people stay tuned to what you're doing? Do you have anything else that you got coming up that you would like to share with our audience?
So yeah, thank you for that. A couple of things. So I actually like have a copy of my book here. Um, you can buy it, like it's basically available wherever. Like you can buy it at Amazon. If you buy it from Rosenfeld Media, which is my publisher, you get an ebook included as well when you purchase there. And you can follow the work of my, really brilliant team of design researchers and strategists at optimistic.design. That's our website, and you can connect with us on LinkedIn. Either me personally, I'm the only Sheryl Cababa that's up there, and Optimistic Design, we're up there as well. I am not really on other social media in a very active way right now because I'm trying to figure out what to do about those other places.
I know,
Um,
me too.
I am like one of my photographer friends like quit Instagram and went up on Blue Sky, and so that encouraged me to open a Blue Sky account just to like be able to continue to see his photos. But I'm just
Yeah,
like, maybe there was a moment where I just like don't actively get into other social media channels.
take a break.
Yeah, take a break and be intentional and strategic about it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I love it. I love it. Well, it's been a joy and honor speaking with you today. Thank you so much. Everybody on the call, go check out Cheryl's book. Follow her on LinkedIn at Sheryl Cababa. Um, Thank you so much for tuning in. And thank you, Sheryl, for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jyoti. This has been a real joy to talk to you this morning, and especially in light of like the sort of like events landscape we're in. It's so nice to just, I don't know, speak to a friend and someone who has such a positive energy. I love it.
Oh, it's been my honor, and thank you. I had a lot of anxiety yesterday, and I thank goodness I'm feeling a lot better today. So I
You
appreciate
take it
you.
day by day.
I know, right? Yeah, thank you to those who tuned in. I see Peter Coughlin's on the call. Thank you for tuning in, Peter, and all the rest of you as well. It's been a joy having you join this episode of Cultural Luminaries. We will be back, not next Friday, potentially the Friday after. I'm moving into a new rhythm, away from a weekly rhythm with this show as I get ready for my own book launch on March 5th. So thank you for your listenership, your viewership, and if you want to stay tuned to future episodes, make sure you're signed up to my LinkedIn or my newsletter. And I will be sending out an update on who my next guest will be. But I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. You've been listening to Cultural Luminaries, where we showcase the future of work through talking with leaders who are lighting the way in emotional intelligence, creativity, and systems change. Goodbye.